Hey guys, I just wanted to hop in quickly before the video starts to explain that this video is unfortunately audio only. The original with the visuals was unfortunately claimed. I did try re-editing a number of times in a number of ways, but eventually just had to cut my losses and upload this version. I am sorry. The original is however available on my Patreon if you would like to see it. Also, hello, long time no see. I must apologise for my unintentionally long absence. It wasn't you, it was me. I wanted to push ahead with this video in part because it felt like the right return to YouTube. It's as good an explanation I can give as to where I've been. I talk a lot about my job. At the start of the video I say something about starting in July. That was last July. I've been doing this for almost a year and a half now. I also now manage the service I've been working at. At the same time, I won't use that as an excuse. As it always has been, YouTube remains one facet of my life, and I also feel like that's what enables me to keep making interesting videos. I only value this space more as time goes on, as an opportunity for reflection and evolution, a space to step back from everything and breathe. So while I know that this is the bit where I'm meant to say that I'm back, it's unfortunately not quite that simple. I still don't entirely know how YouTube fits into the life I'm living now, only that I still want it to as much as ever. I can only ask that you, as a viewer, understand that. But if you're watching this, then I guess you already do. For now, I'm not going to say goodbye, but see you soon. Thank you, as always, and please enjoy the video. Back in July, I posted a 6-hour video, then disappeared for the rest of the year. This wasn't my explicit intention. I did need a break, but that wasn't all. In July, I also started my first full-time job, working with people who are homeless. It both was and wasn't what I expected to be doing after university. When I graduated, I started looking for a job that would help me on my way to qualifying as a psychologist. I'd never considered a job in the homelessness sector until one was recommended to me online. I realised I'd stumbled upon a hidden goldmine of experience, working with people with offending backgrounds as I was looking to specialise in, but also substance misuse, mental health, disability, migrants and refugees, those fleeing abuse and violence and more. The fact that this particular job was also based in the area I grew up in felt like a sign. It was a swerve, but I had a good feeling about it. Luckily, when I went for the interview, that feeling was mutual, and here we are. Tokyo Godfathers was released in 2003, the third film to be directed by the late and great Satoshi Kon, produced by Madhouse. I first saw Tokyo Godfathers about 2 years ago, at which point I loved it, but didn't have much to say about it. I had a hunch that might change if I rewatched it now. Spoiler, it did. Let's get into it.
Babies are always better off with their real parents. You know that.
I don't think that's always the case.
Tokyo Godfathers, set as the title suggests in Tokyo, has 3 central characters. Gin, a middle-aged man with a drinking problem, Hana, a former drag performer, and Miyuki, a teenage runaway. All 3 are homeless. On Christmas Eve, while scavenging through rubbish, the group find an abandoned baby and make a mission of reuniting it with its parents. For Tokyo Godfathers to be a film about homelessness, it must also be a film about home. Satoshi Kon offers a refreshing spin on the archetypal cozy Christmas movie, so often centrally concerned with the theme of family. Gin has a family, but left his wife and daughter many years before after developing addictions to alcohol and gambling and entrenching them in debt. Hana grew up in care before becoming a drag queen, but left the establishment she worked at after a fight with a patron, then lost her boyfriend and found herself on the street. Miyuki experienced a breakdown in the relationship with her father that culminated with her assaulting him, and then ran away from the house she grew up in. Immediately after introducing us to its cast, Tokyo Godfathers presents us with a striking juxtaposition.
It's been
abandoned.
Vulnerable though our trio already seem, the newly christened Kyoko, around whom the story pivots, is an absolute representation of abandonment, and will undoubtedly die if left alone. The group thus forget their own need to stay warm and fed and immediately focus their efforts on caring for the newborn with no capacity to ensure her own safety. pooling what little money they have to buy bottled water to make milk, then setting out through the snow to take Kyoko to the police station. We're never told exactly how long Gin, Hana and Miyuki have known each other, though they bicker and look out for one another in turn as though they've never known any different. But we can see how Kyoko transforms the dynamic. The three individuals with their distinct personalities clearly clash on a regular basis, but for now our cast do their best to set aside their differences and collaborate for Kyoko's sake. Kyoko gives them purpose, and this purpose acts as an ignition. People don't only need to be cared for, but to care for others. Giving to somebody else can be the only way to fill the hole left by what you haven't gotten yourself. And as the group silently resolve not to let Kyoko turn out like them, they begin to share what that really means. How they ended up here. Home and family are inextricably intertwined concepts. In the UK, you can be legally considered to be homeless even if you have a house to return to if you are not safe in that house. This is a deliberately vague definition. After all, what if there's no risk of violence, but your relationship with your family breaks down? Or your relationship with your partner? What if you don't feel comfortable somewhere anymore for one reason or another? So much so that you'd rather leave, even if you have nowhere else to go. When I started my job, I had a pretty basic idea of what homelessness meant. I treated it as being more or less synonymous with rough sleeping. But rough sleeping is only the most visible consequence of homelessness, not a definition, of which there are as many as there are people. Gin and Miyuki have houses to return to. The families they fled are, in fact, actively searching for them. They state it themselves, almost indignantly, even to one another. They can go back at any time. They choose not to. But a house is not a home, and it's abundantly clear that the group feel more secure together in their tent pitched out in the icy cold than they do stuck between four walls with their flesh and blood. Homeless people in Japan find themselves in a strange predicament. While begging on the street is illegal in both the UK and Japan, it's still commonly seen in the former alone. In the UK, there's an understanding that people with the need are supported by society, whereas in Japan, the poor are expected to be supported by, quote, family, relatives, or by themselves. One study by Professor Yoshihiro Okamoto of Tokyo University found that in Japan, over half of rough sleepers were working, as compared to less than 10% in England, though half of the rest claimed to be seeking jobs. Furthermore, only 3% of rough sleepers in Japan were receiving benefits and allowances, compared to 63% in England. At the time of the study's publication in 2007, people only became eligible for benefits in Japan if they were currently jobless, but had worked for more than 26 days in the last 2 months. As Okamoto describes, quote, "These high rates of employment and job seeking contrast with the common image that homeless people do not wish to work, and yet this conservative attitude towards public assistance for the destitute inherently discourages seeking support or feeling deserving of it." Tokyo Godfathers shows a deep understanding of such feelings. In one scene, an elderly and dying homeless man Gin comes across makes a final request to Gin to dispose of his belongings so that his body can't be identified, saying that people will be hurt if it's known who he is. When the elderly man says he's worthless trash, as good dead as alive, Gin refutes it, minutes after this.
Can I help you?
I have some trash to get rid of. I don't think I'm gonna fit.
Nothing will dehumanize a person, to both themselves and society at large, faster than depriving them of the means to meet their basic needs. I've seen people on their first day of street homelessness, sharp and determined, coming to our service to shower and eat, then heading over to the job centre, then for an appointment with their housing officer, then to get a copy of their bank statements or GP summary to aid their application for assistance, and so on. I've seen them on their 5th day, tired, hungry, I notice they've stopped brushing their hair or their teeth as they stop by before they head off to a job interview or a flat viewing, before another long night on the pavement, in McDonald's, on the bus or in a park. I've seen them on the 10th day, when they were assaulted and had their belongings stolen overnight, and they missed their appointment to be assessed for a room in temporary accommodation because they were at the police station, and had to walk for an hour to get to us, and have arrived to find out they missed their slot for the washing machine and now somebody else is using it. I regularly meet people who haven't had access to a shower or clean clothes to change into for weeks on end, or who've lost the capacity to care for themselves in the most basic of ways, some of the effects of which that I've witnessed being so extreme they don't bear repeating. I've lost count of how many people I've seen break down in front of me, not even because of how difficult their day or week has been, but because they're not afforded the dignity of choosing whether or not to share that. Their intensely personal struggles declare themselves to every stranger, a label perhaps already applied merely on account of their appearance. I've seen people become more and more unkempt, more and more unwell, more and more drunk, more and more angry, all of it a vicious cycle, as their shame at being unable to present themselves as they want to be perceived to the rest of the world drives them deeper into self-neglect. Sometimes that shame means that even believing you deserve better becomes a struggle, let alone making that a reality. It's easy to ignore the homeless. Sometimes it can feel as though the kindest thing you can do is look away. But rough sleepers are also one of the most visible demonstrations of the fact that people are struggling to afford to live and left without a safety net, that a country's social infrastructure is collapsing. In many ways, homelessness is a representation of everything wrong with the UK right now. It's a scary thing to acknowledge. I found it easy to feel my own shame passing rough sleepers on the streets. Shame at the fact that I have a home to go back to even though I've done nothing more to deserve it than them. While acknowledging the refrain that anybody can become homeless, I've subconsciously drawn a line between the phenomenon and myself, awarding myself a kind of intangible, undefinable and absolute privilege that doesn't actually exist. The privileges I do possess are many, but a guarantee that that person on the street will never be me is not one of them, nor is it yours. There are common patterns in the stories I hear from the people I work with. Women fleeing abuse, asylum seekers who the Home Office have turfed out of their accommodation once they've been awarded refugee status, men who've been released from prison straight onto the street. But no two stories are exactly the same. When I ask people to explain what brought them to us that day, the tale often stretches back to their childhood, an impossibly tangled and complex chain of cause and effect, where the concept of choice becomes utterly lost. There's plenty of sympathy to go around for the experiences that often lead to homelessness. Bereavements, illnesses, disasters, indiscriminate tragedies. There's less when the effects of these experiences become visible to others in the form of crime or substance use, and less still when these experiences form the foundations of a cycle, keeping people entrenched as all their effort goes to keeping their heads above water. We've all heard the advice not to give beggars money in case it will only feed their addictions. When did we decide that our empathy was conditional on such baseless judgments? In doing so, we cast ourselves simultaneously as arbiters and saviours, depriving the individual of the agency to make their own choices, choosing who deserves our help. In one particularly interesting study, experimental psychology professor Dr. Lizana Harris of University College London was exploring which parts of the brain were activated when participants looked at images of different people. He stumbled upon the finding that homeless people alone, namely images of rough sleepers, weren't actually processed as images of people at all. Rather than the medial prefrontal cortex that had lit up for every other image, the parts of the brain that registered activity when presented with these images were the left insula and the right amygdala, the areas associated with processing objects. If I'm a busy person going through a city like London where there are tons of homeless people and I have to stop and consider the minds of all of these people, that might make me feel very uncomfortable, Dr. Harris explains. Moreover, if I don't feel like I have the resources to help, there's nothing I can do to alleviate that suffering. That feeling stays with you. Our brain says instead, if I take a second to stop and think about your suffering, it's going to make me feel bad. So, dehumanization becomes a kind of emotion regulation strategy. He goes on to say, we've developed this as a strategy to help us get through our social environment. Most people think, and rightly so, that homeless people are having very negative experiences and constantly suffering. We may not always want to resonate with that suffering. Because of that, we lose sight of the fact that these are just regular people. Is it because we think we are not like the homeless man on the street? Are we afraid it will cost us something if we engage with his existence? Or worry we might feel bad about our part of the inequality problem if we look one another in the eye? Is dehumanization automatic? Or is there, at some point, some intentionality behind turning off our empathy machines? Such processes begin as a defense mechanism. Even so, the implications of this study are immense. The findings demonstrate that we see society's extreme outgroups as quite literally less than human. The chances are that without experiencing any overt, conscious malice towards such groups, your brain would show these same patterns. The homelessness charity Crisis report that in the UK almost 8 out of 10 rough sleepers have suffered some sort of violence, abuse or antisocial behaviour in the last year, including being hit, kicked, having things thrown at them, being urinated on, and experiencing sexual violence. In Japan, one paper published in 2007 described incidents such as rough sleepers being thrown into a river, having their belongings set fire to, and even being killed. Tokyo Godfathers acknowledges the violence rough sleepers are so often subjected to in a scene where a group of young men attack Gin and the now deceased elderly man's body, claiming to be cleaning up the streets. While we might wonder how anybody could commit such extreme acts of cruelty, Dr. Harris's study begins to present uncomfortable yet important answers. The last 6 months have made me realise not only the dangers but also the emptiness in a world where nobody feels they owe anybody else anything. It takes energy and often courage to look a homeless person and their experience of the world in the eye, but it's a more than fair exchange. Rather than the overwhelming sense of sadness and powerlessness I had expected, getting to know the people living these lives has given me the opposite, a weightlessness, a sense of comfort I hadn't known I could feel walking through the city. My job has changed the way I engage with the world on a daily basis. I have felt the shift happen, where I go from often not registering homeless people at all to seeing each of them as exactly that, people. And it has made me feel a much deeper sense of connection to the world around me and community within it. The best thing I can think to compare it to is the concept of Sonda, the, quote, profound feeling of realising that everyone, including strangers passing in the streets, has a life as complex as one's own, which they are constantly living despite one's personal lack of awareness of it. As humans, we group people, and what if your associations with the people sitting on the pavement weren't filth, addiction, poverty and violence, but laughter, shared stories and experiences, endearing quirks, great kindness and compassion. Gi, Hana and Miyuki exercise unconditional acceptance. They don't know one another's stories and they don't need to. We see at one point that Gin is feared by some of the other homeless men Miyuki bumps into, but this comes as a surprise to the viewer. Gin may well be the villain of other people's stories, the wife and daughter he abandoned for example, but we meet him as the rough and ready but decidedly kind-hearted father figure to Miyuki and 1/3 of Kyoko's unlikely trio of saviours, willing to risk his life for her. In Tokyo Godfathers, Gin is the good guy. It's a vivid illustration of something I've also learned again and again in my job, reading through people's criminal records, uncovering their histories, and trying to reconcile these things with the person I know and have come to truly care for. Again and again, I've come up against the unshakable truth that everyone has good in them, at least when given a non-judgmental environment within which to let that good show through. While every person experiencing homelessness has a unique story, Tokyo Godfathers equally highlights the common theme of the absurdity of life. Hana's partner Ken dying after slipping on a bar of soap in the shower, for example. Throughout the film, levity is inextricably intertwined with tragedy. Tokyo Godfathers acknowledges the unimaginable hardship and horrific suffering the homeless are subjected to, while embracing humour and beauty in equal measure, and in doing so is exactly as honest as its characters deserve. Above all, Tokyo Godfathers champions goodness. Satoshi Kon notes the meaningful coincidences at the heart of the film that move the story forwards, and how through these, quote, each of the main characters recovers the connection with their original family that they have lost. It's Tokyo Godfather's own brand of magic, the light needed in an otherwise painfully real story. But these coincidences aren't as they seem. Rather, characters who would otherwise never cross paths are repeatedly brought together through good deeds, deliberate acts of humanity towards one another. Ging uses the little money he had painstakingly saved to give to his estranged daughter to instead pay for Hana's hospital treatment when she collapses, for example, only to have this lead him back to that very daughter, now working as a nurse. Tokyo Godfathers demonstrates again and again that even in a city seething with strangers, people are connected, whether they want to be or not, and so that we might as well define our connections by acts of kindness. It's a phenomenally hopeful film. We could say that every good thing that happens to the characters in Tokyo Godfathers is pure luck, but by highlighting the karmic nature of these supposed miraculous coincidences, it gifts us with something more concrete, more meaningful. A reminder that, after a chain of catastrophe, good can also come our way, equally as unexpected. All Tokyo Godfathers is really doing is giving the characters back the compassion they've shown, but in ways that remind us that even when all seems lost, there are miracles to hold on for. Life can always throw curveballs, but who said they all have to be bad?
Unbelievable. What a world.
She's a girl! How precious are you? And what's your name?
From the film's outset, radically, it's the flawed Ging, Hana and Miyuki who are painted as the good in a broken world, and as their own saviours. Kon stated that he, quote, did not intend to portray homeless people as representatives of weakness and unhappiness, or as a hindrance to society, and that, quote, they are unhappy not because they are homeless, but because their lives have lost their former glow, and that happiness lies in the process of recovery, which is the story of this work itself. We can only connect the dots looking back. Bad things lead to good as much as good things do to bad, and they all eventually become a singular narrative unique to us that we are tasked with making sense of. Above all, Tokyo Godfathers argues more convincingly than most that attempting to understand and caring for others is never a losing game, and that this is perhaps the only way to make sense of the past and to find a way forwards. A few months ago, on a cold night, I was on my way to the bus stop after my work Christmas party, walking through a tunnel I've walked through a million times in my life ever since I was a child. I stopped to give money to somebody sitting on the street, only to realise I already knew him from work, and proceeded to have a nice conversation with him. It was late and I could feel the eyes on us as people walked past, most likely wondering if I was okay or just what I was doing. It's moments like these that make me realise how much my experience of the world has changed in the last year, how much less it's defined by fear, and by barriers placed reasonably but often meaninglessly between myself and others. At first seemingly dissonant with the subject matter, Tokyo Godfathers is revolutionary because of its silliness, its refusal to treat the homeless as painful to consider by default. To again quote Dr. Harris, "It happens the minute you realise that these are just regular people and their minds aren't threatening or scary or depressing. That's when things start to change." So yes, it can be overwhelming to see mattresses and tents lining the streets, and hard to look people begging for necessities in the eye. It can be tempting to surrender to hopelessness, the feeling that there's nothing worthwhile within your power to do, but that simply isn't true. There's nothing I can end this video with that you can't already easily Google and don't most likely already know. You can tell your political representatives that homelessness is an issue that sways your vote and hold them accountable. More directly, you can donate to or volunteer for charities and other relevant organisations. If you live in England or Wales, you can download the StreetLink app and send a location alert if you see somebody sleeping rough, in order to link them up with their local outreach team. All these things can still feel perfunctory. They're useful, but may not allow you to feel the real impact your actions have on other people, the thing we really need to remedy our defensive detachment. In the end, if you want to know how to help somebody who is homeless, you can do something simpler than any of these options that, for so many reasons, we often fail to consider. Stop and ask.